Welcome to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, where we talk about historical drama series and films as windows to the past and mirrors of the present. I'm Michonne Boston.
And I'm Tequina Boston. This is Revolution to Rights, America at 250, a 10-episode podcast series from Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters. Revolution to Rights takes you on a journey through America's 250-year history of advancing freedom and justice since the Declaration of Independence in 1776.
The historical dramas featured in Revolution to Rights tell stories of battles fought in the quest for freedom and the people whose collective actions and courage inspire us to move beyond remembrance and to take actions today to ensure freedom and justice for all.
3 questions frame the Revolution to Rights series. Do the inalienable rights named in the Declaration of Independence belong to all people or a privileged class?
What can history teach us about what it takes to extend and sustain rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness?
What are the roles of leaders and citizens today in preserving the democratic values that gave birth to the United States?
Answers to these questions determine what it means to be American and what the nation will become.
The poet Audre Lorde said, "Revolution is not a one-time event." While the official American Revolution dates to the late 1700s, the meaning of revolution was tested in the time of President Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War, and the abolition movements of the 19th century, when once again the question of rights was debated. The meaning of rights and who is included in those rights continues to be debated and is evident in the issues that divide the United States 250 years later.
We begin Revolution to Rights, America at 250 with 3 films that depict those times: Lincoln, Harriet, and Glory. The films show 3 strategies used to win and advance rights in the United States: legislation or laws reflected in the 2012 film Lincoln, resistance to unjust laws by freedom seekers reflected in the 2019 film Harriet, and military service as seen in the 1989 film Glory.
These films are a window to what it was like for the people working to achieve, extend, and strengthen rights named in the Declaration of Independence and later the U.S. Constitution. And they enable us to see the connections to the debates, divides, and justice movements that still occur in our own time.
We kick off our Revolution to Rights series with Lincoln. Released in 2012, the film Lincoln is the portrait of President Abraham Lincoln's struggles to navigate the moral and political complexities surrounding the passage of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution at the end of the Civil War. The 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865 and went beyond Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation to abolish slavery and involuntary servitude throughout the U.S. and its territories, except as punishment for a crime. The film Lincoln is based in part on the Pulitzer Prize-winning book Team of Rivals: The Political Genius of Abraham Lincoln by Doris Kearns Goodwin. Lincoln not only highlights the complexities of leadership and governance, but also raises profound questions about justice, equality, and the moral responsibilities of those in power. Living in Washington, D.C. puts us in contact with Civil War history, where Tequina and I can visit the landmarks, historic homes, monuments, schools, and streets named for prominent figures of the Civil War and Reconstruction eras. Abraham Lincoln's presidency is seen and continues to be felt throughout the city, and the U.S. Capitol building, built by enslaved workers and completed after emancipation, is a reminder of the struggles to form that more perfect union.
Our guest for this conversation about Abraham Lincoln and the political urgency to pass the 13th Amendment to the Constitution is the Honorable Sharon Pratt, former mayor of Washington, D.C. When Mayor Pratt took the oath of office in 1991, she became the first African-American female mayor of a major U.S. city. Mayor Pratt is currently the founding director of the Institute for Politics, Policy, and History, established on the campus of the University of the District of Columbia by Mayor Muriel Bowser. IPPH rediscovers and showcases the history of Washington, D.C., which includes a substantial Lincoln presence and impact on the city. IPPH has presented public programs including Lincoln, a Providential President at Ford's Theater, Frederick Douglass at the Frederick Douglass House in Anacostia, D.C., and President Ulysses S. Grant, an inclusive president. We'll include a link to IPPH on the webpage for this podcast, where you can learn more about their programs and Mayor Sharon Pratt.
Welcome, Mayor Pratt, to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters.
Delighted to be with you.
Let's start with what we learned in school about Lincoln and history, because that's one of the reasons why we do this podcast, because we are diving in deeper into history, most of the histories that we didn't get when we were in school. But let's start with your background with K through 12. What were you taught about the U.S. Civil War and Lincoln, and how did that history evolve for you in your adult years?
It's an interesting question because it made me think back. I'm old enough to have attended, in part, segregated schools in Washington through the fifth grade, and then integrated schools. I'd have to say both were reasonably superficial in terms of a reflection on the Civil War. Yes, there was a Civil War. It was always presented as if it was always a war to end slavery, which it was not. Lincoln is painted as sort of a amorphous sort of type saintly figure. And that was true in both the segregated school system and the integrated school system. They just sort of gloss over the particulars of that war as well as the particulars of his profile.
And you are the founding director of the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History in D.C. So I'm thinking that might have influenced your decision to start this organization. Tell us about the inspiration for the founding of IPPH and its role in shaping leadership.
Well, IPPH primarily is focused on elevating and I say celebrating the history of Washington, D.C. We're one of the first instances in the world history of a nation creating a capital, for the nation. One of the very first things that they do after the ratification of the Constitution. And we are such an important part of the American narrative in terms of the home of this we the people government. And yet there's almost no scholarship about Washington, D.C. What people know about Washington, D.C. is based upon the monuments and or a politician campaigning against Washington, D.C. And so it was my thought, and certainly Mayor Bowser, who is also many generations in D.C., and an enthusiast on the question of history of Washington, D.C. We needed to have an institute. We needed to have a place that really promoted these stories about Washington, D.C.
Well, as you were saying, I mean, here is a capital city that was formed as part of the creation of a nation. And our podcast, looking at the series, looking from revolution to rights, actually is starting with this Civil War period because, in a sense, it was when the nation was deciding whether or not its promises belong to everyone or if they only belong to certain people. And in the film Lincoln, which I watched 3 times in preparation for this conversation, I had seen it when it came out, but it shows the last 4 months of Abraham Lincoln's life when he is determined to have the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution passed by the House of Representatives. The Senate had already passed it in 1864. And the purpose of that 13th Amendment was to abolish slavery and involuntary servitude. And yet, what the film, I think, shows so in such a nuanced way is that, one, the motivations for passing that amendment weren't shared. You have the conservative Republicans like Preston Blair and his son, and you have the radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens in the film. And Lincoln's challenge is not only to get his Republican Party to pass the amendment, but get what he calls the lame duck Democrats to also pass it. And so you see this very nuanced process of negotiation and strategy, et cetera. So, in your thoughts, what does the film reveal about, I would say, politics, policy, and history as you look at Lincoln and his urgent push to get the 13th Amendment passed? I think in something like 4 weeks. It's January, and he wants it passed by January 31st of 1865.
Well, one thing it does show you is the horse trading that occurs when you are effective. In this regard, also, it does help sometimes, not sometimes, I'd say almost always, to have a leader, as you do with Lincoln, and then let's say later in life, Lyndon Johnson, who really come from a hard scrabble background. They really get the motivations of individuals who are not walking around thinking about policy. They're thinking about, do I get an appointment? Can I deliver to my constituents? What are the basic economic issues, survival issues? And he understood that. And he knew he had to do some horse trading. There's no way in the world. First off, unless you were Thaddeus Stevens or one of the radical Republicans, there was not a real commitment to ending slavery in that sense. There was not a real commitment to respecting African Americans as equal individuals. Lincoln himself, that's one thing I think Spielberg does touch upon appropriately. He's struggling with the concept himself. He simply thinks slavery is wrong. And so it was a great depiction of the horse trading that occurs, how you have to find people where they are in order to get the votes that you need in this moment. That was the bottom line. It wasn't a great statement. It was about, marshaling those votes.
Right. Yes, yes. And just for those who have not read the 13th Amendment, it reads neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Now, what I found interesting watching the film was that the 13th Amendment, I mean, this urgency Lincoln felt. And it was interesting, too, hearing him being called possibly a dictator, that he was ignoring the courts, etc. And some people think, well, didn't the Emancipation Proclamation abolish slavery? And yet Lincoln, and we learned this at the President Lincoln Cottage as well, he was really struggling with the legal dimensions of how do you really give this law some teeth. So, what made the passage of that 13th Amendment so urgent for President Lincoln and for the enslaved and formerly enslaved Black people in the United States?
Well, first off, the Emancipation Proclamation basically treated it as a implement of war. In other words, it was his position as the commander, the commander in chief of the military that allowed him to bypass, any role for Congress, state legislatures in getting it done. So that was a problem. And secondly, how did they approach it? They approached it as we're denying our adversary any assets and enslaved people, which should be therefore treated as contraband. That was General Butler. And so that would be the argument of, not getting into the particulars of whether it's right or whether it's wrong. You should be denied the benefits of enslaved people in terms of our ability to win this war. And so the Emancipation Proclamation only extended to the rebel states. And further, you would have to question it once the war was ended, which is another reason I think he was eager to get it done before officially the end of the war. But that was also another problem he had in horse trading. People say, well, we'll do it if this is the way to end this doggone war, but we don't really believe in it. Um, so at any rate, Lincoln was smart enough to, as he'd been self-trained as a lawyer, he understood that it would be all over, and it would be disastrous for the country had you gone back to slavery. Because there was also an economic issue with the industrial North and an agrarian South, and which side was going to prevail in the expansion of America. And the North says, no, we've got to be an industrial nation.
Right, yeah, and then it also would have meant so many lives lost, and for what outcome, what purpose, really?
Yeah. Although, I do ask the question, how many of those Union soldiers? I mean, that's quite substantial. I mean, that was a long, ugly war.
Yes.
I mean, we really lost a lot of people. How many of them entered that war because they believed that you had to end slavery? Or how many of them entered that war because they were trying to hang on to this new idea that was only established barely 100 years ago of this new nation? Many were hanging on to the notion of this new nation.
Mhm.
How many were in there fighting really for the, end of slavery? The war, I think, helped to educate America to the value and the worth of African Americans because they wouldn't have won the war in the minds of many without those Black soldiers.
For sure, and that's another film we'll be covering will be Glory.
Yeah, I think that's very well done.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like what you said about what were they holding on to, the idea or ideal of a new nation. Um, because I think part of that idea or ideal is that we're continuing on this track to defining freedom. What does freedom really mean in the United States? And the 13th Amendment alone just couldn't support that, in
Right.
terms of racial equality and eliminating Jim Crow laws pre, during, and after the 13th Amendment was passed. Um, I mean, just as President Lincoln understood that the Emancipation Proclamation was not sufficient to secure the freedom of enslaved persons in the South, there had to be something that came after. And after his assassination, we get the 14th Amendment, which covers citizenship rights and equal protection. And we're debating that one right now, which is concerning.
Yeah.
And the 15th Amendment guaranteeing the right to vote for men, regardless of race. So we get the 19th Amendment in 1920 for women to gain the vote. In your opinion, how do these three amendments work together to ensure the rights of people in the United States? I know Charles Hamilton Houston is one of those people who connected the dots between these three amendments to end segregation. And you mentioned before you went to segregated schools. What needs to happen to prevent people from losing those rights as stated, and how can we improve on them?
One of the things I do think we should point out, and I hadn't thought about it till I heard Professor Chris Bonner talk about it, um, is that citizenship had never been truly defined in the country. And think of it, we were all a new idea. The
Mhm.
notion of a society where we, the people, would govern was everybody said, "What the heck is that?" Madison took the lead on trying to put the elements of it together, but it wasn't until the 14th Amendment that we got around to starting to define citizenship. And Bonner does a great job of highlighting how it is the efforts of African Americans, because we desperately, because of the caste system in America, we were something almost other than other human beings in the country. And so we really had to push this and use the legal system, be it courts, and eventually, passing legislation or an amendment to the Constitution where this notion was defined, which redounded to the benefit of so many, because suddenly there was a definition of what does it mean to be a citizen. So you had to have the 14th Amendment. And Lincoln, of course, himself talked of having the rights, having black soldiers in particular who had fought so valiantly in the Civil War to have the right to vote. And, again, part of that I've discovered lately is that when he said that out on the portico at the White House, or after they came back, announced Appomattox, one of the people on the grounds was John Wilkes Booth. And when he heard him say that, he leaned over to somebody and said, "That'll be the last speech he gives." And it was.
Mhm.
Mm.
Mhm.
I mean, that's right. And of course, it didn't really happen until 1965 because of Jim Crow and so much that occurred. But that is it has made all the difference. And that's why we're still fighting about it today. That's why you got gerrymandering going on, everything in the world. I mean, that is where your citizenship gets expressed.
Yes, and it's my understanding that the radical Republicans during Reconstruction actually were trying to pass voting rights laws that were even stronger than the ones that we were able to pass in the 1960s.
No, they were there's a reason they call them radical
Yes.
and radical Republic. No, they were out there. And they, I would say by and large, they were clearly driven by the notion this is wrong. We've got to turn this around. They also understood that you needed to have that voting prerogative on the part,
Yes.
at least of the black men, in order to preserve your political position. Because once the
Absolutely.
war was over, all heck was going to break loose.
And it did.
Yeah, and it did. Yeah.
Yeah.
And as soon as they started cutting deals around having soldiers to protect the right to vote and pulling those soldiers, that was the end of it. It was the end of Reconstruction, it was the end of all of it, because voting rights is everything. That's for everything.
Let's talk about the responsibility of leadership. We've talked about the responsibility of citizens and voting rights, exercising voting rights. Now, leaders are part of this ideal and idea too. And there are certain attributes that make them effective in the times when they are called to lead. And there are challenging times that can also shape the person's leadership. Going back to the Lincoln, the history, and even what we see in the film, what attributes of character and leadership made Lincoln able to meet the challenges of leading the nation through a divisive civil war?
Well, I almost believe he was a providential presidency. I really do. Was he a perfect man? Hardly. But he was perfect for that moment. It was utterly improbable he'd even be a nominee, much less win. I mean, he'd only been a congressman, one term, I think it was, um, and nothing compelling, arguably, about his profile in the way, uh, of others, and yet he did win. He had a capacity to relate to the common man. He understood the needs of people, but above all, he had a moral center. He had
Mm.
a moral center, and it mattered to him in posterity that he was faithful to that moral center. It did matter to him, and he wasn't trying to be a saint, but he didn't want to, be unfaithful to that moral center, and he always believed that slavery was wrong. He wasn't there on that black people were equal to white people. It took him a while, but the war and watching those soldiers had played a big role in that. He was driven to make his mark. He just was driven to make his mark. You can't get there if you don't have a moral center. We have a lot of people who move based upon opportunity and expediency. And if that's all that's driving you, God help you. We're not going to have a leader. The first order of business in a we the people government is that you do have to represent the people. You can't get too far out ahead of them. And, some people often are critical of Lincoln because he was late getting there. Um, but I learned early on in my political career is that they used to say a leader without a following is just a man out taking a walk. So if you don't have anybody following you, you're not a leader. And so Lincoln always understood that he had to get other people on board, a significant concentration of others on board for whatever the reason. The reason is I just want to end this daggone war. I'm tired of, having it my sons and so forth, consumed by it. Others were, I want to be in charge. I want the Republicans to be in charge. And if this is a way to get there, I'm all for it. Whatever the reason, he had to get a concentration of followers. Otherwise, he wasn't going to be a leader. He also always understood that. He always understood that. And so he never got out there too far ahead. I can think of how many people they were Speaker of the House, Ryan, others, and they come out with these statements, and then nobody in the world was there with them in the House. You never see Pelosi, never would she step out there unless she had counted her votes. You never saw out there just talking to herself. She had her votes when she stepped. That's a leader.
Mhm.
That's a leader. And that's what also Lincoln was. I say it was providential. I've had others, but I've raised this with historians and biographers of Lincoln. They said I'd gone a little too far. But, Appomattox occurred on Palm Sunday, and Lincoln decides he's going to go see, what is it, to the Ford Theater, Our American
American Cousin.
Yeah. And by chance, only by chance, does John Wilkes Booth show up at the Ford Theater earlier that day because he's trying to collect his mail. He was an actor there and had actually taken a nap over across the street in the same place where Lincoln will die.
Wow.
And discovers when he's there collecting his mail that the Lincolns and possibly the Grants will be there that night. So he decides this is his opportunity, because he'd already said that out on the lawn of the White House, that this would be his last speech. And that's Good Friday, when the fatal shot occurs. And the nation, when do they mourn him? Easter Sunday. I mean, they're mourning him. The people said, "Now you're going too far now." They're saying, but it's almost providential. I mean, it was his presidency. He was not a saint, but he was the right man for that time. You could not, Thaddeus Stevens, people like, no chance of keeping the country together or marshaling the votes for the 13th Amendment. And because he was assassinated, that ensured the 14th and 15th Amendment because he was assassinated.
Wow.
In the same way, Kennedy's death ensured that Lyndon Johnson, who was also a man who knew how to count his votes, could move on civil rights legislation and and ultimately the Voting Rights Act. It was those series of assassinations that sort of, where there's a collective shame and a desire to make good on the stated mission of someone, that paves the way for a seminal moment. And in this way, his life, his political life, was a sacrifice and a testament to that important moment in American history.
Hmm. Well, we say that truth is stranger than fiction, but it seems like history also is more momentous than some of our fiction as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you go back and kind of look at it, you say, wow, this is like crazy that he actually got there. Uh, and yet he managed to, keep this country together. And it's a battle. A lot of the issues we fought then are still issues that are in the underbelly of the nation today. But he managed to navigate it. And what did he say? I'm going to speak to our better angels.
Yes.
And some people are meant for the moment. And in this regard, you could have hope for America because these special individuals seem to emerge when we most desperately need
Yeah.
them, and they are providential.
Yeah, in another tradition, I think it's Hindu, the Bhagavad Gita, it says, one translation says, "When evil grows great, I make myself a body. In every age I come."
Mhm.
Let's keep our fingers crossed. We've got those people
Right, yes,
now.
indeed.
Or
We have to cling to that.
or be those people. You've been enjoying Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast where we talk about historical drama films and series as windows to the past and mirrors of the present.
Make sure you subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. Share the excitement with your friends. Visit MichonneBostonGroup.com/Boston Sisters. Join the historical drama community by signing up for our e-newsletter so you'll never miss an update, future episodes, or exclusive bonus content.
Now, back to our fascinating conversation.
That's right, Audre Lorde. We are the ones we've been waiting for.
Yeah.
We talked about some of the contextual environment around Lincoln during his presidency and his decisions during the Civil War time. Were there abolitionists who were talking in his ear, or did he acknowledge the abolitionist movement, or did he keep that to himself, or there were people on his staff, including his household staff, that might have
Yeah.
had his ear?
Well, I mean, I think he listened, and you always have to have people who are there to push a point of view, otherwise it may get utterly lost. Uh, I mean, obviously, Frederick Douglass played a role. I mean, he was one among those. I mean, you had lots of people, Thaddeus Stevens being another, but his household staff, including Keckley, um, he had the good sense to listen, and I think listen with intention. Not everybody really listens.
That's true.
And that's another lesson people learn in politics. More often than not, there's a tendency for us to just talk. But the real strength in politics is to listen because it is this we the people government. So I do think he listened. I think he grew. I think he was it's very difficult in America with our caste system not to walk away with biases about who's has value and who doesn't. I mean, it's just very difficult, women included, but certainly Black Americans, because we were at the bottom of that caste system and have always been and still fighting it in the 21st century. Also, you have to have special moments. And even though I think the abolitionists played a role, but that's mental. I think when you see people perform so valiantly, as did those Civil War soldiers, um, and give so generously for an idea and for freedom. I mean, it's gotta impact you. It impacted Lincoln, it impacted Grant. It impacted them. It is possibly the reason George Washington of the founding fathers, the only one, even though it was late, uh, freed his enslaved that he had at Mount Vernon, I think because of the role of Black soldiers in the Revolutionary War. And his own ballot, he immediately freed. But it's hard when you're out there struggling in the dirt and cannons coming at you, and somebody's there with you and helping you. Hard to walk away saying, "Oh, this person doesn't have value." I think that war played a major role in transforming, having a influencing his thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the film gets at that very well too. And there's a particular scene. You were mentioning Thaddeus Stevens, where Lincoln is trying to get Stevens to use his influence. And I love the metaphor he uses. He says, if you have a compass, it can tell you where north is, right?
Mhm.
Can't tell you about the mud and the swamps and the rivers and the woods and all the things it's going to take to get you So what good is knowing where north is if you don't take into consideration, as
Right,
you say,
right,
the horse trading, etcetera,
right.
necessary to actually get you there?
Yeah. And it's unfortunate that we have to go to those lengths to have wars to understand. I'm one of those people, just, tell me, show me the evidence of the data, and, we can talk. But that doesn't seem to be the case.
Mm,
Yeah, and I think, it's not an understanding that's always intellectual. It's
right.
a visceral kind of understanding that people have to get to respect and appreciate the needs of others. We've got tensions now in America around a class. I
Mhm.
mean, we've got a real class system or chasm occurring with this billionaire class and billionaires populating the government in such a significant way, and an insensitivity to the pain of the average American. Um, but do they get it? Do they get what it's like to struggle to pay, go to the grocery store? Do they get it? Probably not. And so there may have to be other types of clashes for it to sink in the depth of the pain, the
Yeah,
depth of the angst that people are feeling. And I just think most of us live in our own bubble. All of us are guilty of that.
yeah. Mayor Pratt, this podcast is going to launch our series, Revolution to Rights, where we're looking at the 250-year history of the U.S., not just marking the anniversary of the Declaration of
Right.
Independence, but also looking at how have we been working to advance those ideals for 250 years. And your organization is also doing programming around this 250th anniversary. What would you lift up as Lincoln's most significant legacy in DC's history that we can bear witness to today? And how is your institute marking this history and the kind of programs and plans you have with regard to the 250th anniversary, which is it's kind of ironic who's trying to narrate this history in this moment.
Well, regarding IPPH, so we call it our capital, our stories. That's really our focus, our capital and our stories. And so many rich stories that come out of this that are emblematic of the American narrative. And regarding Lincoln's role, he played a very pivotal role in it, bec- moving from backwater status, sort of a backwater venue to becoming a meaningful metropolis. And of course, that is because the federal government suddenly grew in numbers because of the Civil War. One, because of his role with emancipation. Without a doubt, there was an influx of formerly enslaved across the line into Washington, D.C., because that was the first place to have an emancipation proclamation. um, but secondly, because suddenly you had to have a more robust government. For the longest time, you had hardly anybody in these departments because remember when the country was founded, there was always a resistance on the part of many to having, too much power in the government. Everybody had their own state. Their allegiance was to their own state. And so there was a real resistance to a strong federal government. As and so it wasn't a well-populated place. We just barely got it done in time because only had 10 years to create the Capitol. And again, it would not have been completed if George Washington hadn't died. He died a year before the deadline, and it meant so much to him that suddenly Congress found the money to complete it. And it still was, just barely. I mean, it was Abigail Adams just thought this was hardship duty coming to Washington, D.C. So, but because of prosecuting the Civil War and because of the role of emancipation, suddenly this became a meaningful metropolis. And that continues with Grant because of his role in standing up Reconstruction. And so, the Freedmen's Bureau and all of that, it has a profound impact upon the growth and the profile of Washington, D.C.
Yeah. Yeah, we hope to point our listeners to some of the places they wouldn't normally go to when visiting Washington, D.C. that relate to this conversation, like Lincoln Cottage, or even look and see the Sumner School.
Yeah, the Sumner School, and we're gonna put a lot of the DC archives, in the Sumner School, but Lincoln's Cottage is really a treat. It's a very peaceful place. I mean, it really you feel history when you're there. You don't always feel history, as you well know, at some of the other places, because they're so I don't know, you really have a sense you've gone back in time
Yes,
at
yes.
Lincoln's Cottage, and so it's very special. Well, listen, I grew up in DC. I must have passed Lincoln's Cottage I don't know how many times, just going someplace,
Yep.
and, Old Soldiers Home and all of
Yeah.
that, I knew that was there. It wasn't until very recently that I'd ever gone to Lincoln's Cottage,
Same here. Yeah.
and it never occurred to me, and I was really so, transported by the experience, and it's special. I agree with you. People really need to visit Lincoln's Cottage.
So that message goes to our listeners in Washington, D.C.
Yeah,
Explore
yeah,
your city and in the DMV.
yeah, yeah. No, it's very special.
Mayor Pratt, we've talked a lot about leadership, and your institute is devoted to looking at leadership as well. What lessons can our current leaders learn from President Abraham Lincoln's model? I mean, I think we've already answered that question in many ways, but what are the takeaways of his successes and failures during his presidency?
Well, I mean, the fact that he almost, in some instances, soared past George Washington in terms of the profiles in history, um, is entirely, again, a function of his moral center. I think people struggle now to remain faithful to that moral center, and let's understand the risks were just as great then as are they now. Now, he may have been the first person assassinated, but there's a lot of violence now and a lot of threats to people who try to assert a position that could be perceived as unpopular. Nobody wants to get shot, nobody wants to be threatened, and nobody wants their family to be threatened, but that is what is happening now. What of your convictions? Not easy. And where do we want to be as a nation? We've always struggled with it. And again, what I liked about Lincoln is it let us try to appeal to our better angels. We have always struggled with it, and I don't know where we'll end up, quite frankly. I don't know where we'll end up. I do hope the better angels will prevail. The particularly, then when you the ugliness around immigration was so quick, people so quick, well, people violating the borders and this and that. But my goodness, to see people with masks on coming to get people, it's almost like those slave catchers. I mean,
Yes,
it
yes.
it 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 conjures up images of that. Is that who we are? This is what we wanna be? And at a practical level, who the heck are you gonna have as your contractors? You know, when you're trying to build a road or repair build a house. These are good workers, and, I we're at an inflection point, there's no question about it, and we do have voices out there who do speak up and try to be faithful to their moral center. Now, some people's moral center may be unsettling for others. That may be the case. I'd often want to know what is John Roberts reading when he says he's reading the Constitution, because it's not anything that I saw that James Madison wrote. But obviously, there are people who have immunity for the president, that the Article 2 office has more power than Article 1, the Congress that represents the people. I mean, what in the world are they looking at? And why did Madison and others create the Constitution as they did? Because they always wanted to checkmate the power of another to ensure that the power always stayed with we the people.
People. Yes.
now that you asked the question, one of the things that comes out of all of this, we have taken our democracy for granted. Some people don't even bother to vote. And you think of what people sacrificed for us to have that right, quite apart even before the civil rights movement and all of that, the very people who started the country. I mean, they took on the most formidable navy in the world. They didn't have munitions. Sometimes they didn't have food, and many times they didn't have shoes. But they fought a war for almost 8 years
Yes.
and managed to beat the most formidable navy in the world. And was it all lofty, their goals? But they did have some notion of the power being with the people and not some abusive monarch. And we don't even bother to vote. Now, what has moved the country so that there's more of a competitive environment in the conversation? The marches. When we, the people, get out there with those No Kings marches, it has an impact because then suddenly we realize, no, I'm not alone. There are other people who share my thinking. You cannot expect somebody to be the voice to lead us always. The power must rest with us. That is what people fought for. The power is with us. And so yes, we'd like to have leaders, and we do have people who speak up courageously. But the power in this country belongs with we, the people. And with the capacity of social media and where information is diffused and accessible to anyone all the time, then there is no excuse for us not to assert our power. And I think that is the lesson of the moment in the 21st century. For we, the people, to reclaim our power and for us to be the leaders we're supposed to be.
I say amen to that. And I think our best leaders have always reminded us that we are the power.
Absolutely.
Right. Absolutely.
Well, our last question is, and you probably have a lot of good stories, I'm sure, about DC. Who are the unsung people, or what are the stories you think deserve to come to the screen? Because for some folks, the screen is their portal into history. But we know there are a lot of good stories out there that have yet to be a film or a series. So, what stories would you like to see a film or series about?
Well, we're discovering stories every day to include, again, um, with even the founders of the Hemmings family, and not just because of the impropriety maybe of that relationship, but the most celebrated, ultimately the most defining chef of early America ends up being James Hemmings.
Mhm.
And, he had a tragic life ultimately, but little is said about that Hemmings family. There's an author that we're looking at, Eden Southworth, and she was the most prolific novelist of the late 19th century. And I know I'd never heard of her. So there are many stories like that, but also the stories of the Alethea Tanners of the world who, you know, almost every opportunity, particularly African Americans in Washington, D.C., if they had any opportunity, they were going to find the resources to start a school. I
Mhm.
mean, they always found the resources to start a school. And so there was always this push to move forward education, and the like. I have learned that while I was a student of law, that the role that African Americans have played in terms of defining the most important thing about being an American, citizenship, you know. So all of these are stories that come out of, things we learn about Washington, D.C. But above all, to affirm that unlike any other capital where the palace is the focal point, in this country, in our capital, The focal point is the people's meeting place, the U.S. Capitol. That is what distinguishes our capital, and that is what distinguishes our country.
Well,
Wow.
Mayor Pratt, thank you for joining Taquina and me on Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters to kick off our Revolution to Rights series for the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and this conversation about the Steven Spielberg biopic, Lincoln.
It's a pleasure, and I appreciate the great work that you're doing. I'm honored to be a part of this program.
Lincoln is directed by Steven Spielberg with a screenplay by Tony Kushner. It features a stellar cast that includes an Academy Award-winning performance by Daniel Day-Lewis as the 16th President of the United States, Sally Field as Mary Todd Lincoln, Joseph Gordon-Levitt as their son Robert Lincoln, Tommy Lee Jones as Pennsylvania Republican Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, Hal Holbrook as political advisor and influencer Preston Blair, David Strathairn as Lincoln's Secretary of State William Seward, James Spader as 13th Amendment lobbyist William Nicholas Bilbo, and Gloria Rubin as Mary Todd Lincoln's seamstress and confidant Elizabeth Keckley. Do an online search to find out where you can stream Lincoln. Also, check your local library.
In our next Revolution to Rights America 250 podcast, we talk about the film Harriet and the History of the Underground Railroad with historian Anthony Cohen, founder of the Mayor Foundation. In 1996, Anthony Cohen recreated the journey of self-emancipation by foot, rail, and boat from Maryland to Canada, and later prepared Oprah for her role as Setha in the 1998 film Beloved.
And so we were going to put her inside this crate, inside of the back of a horse-drawn wagon, all of which we got, and carry her for several hours across the landscape at night. I brought in a guy with bloodhounds from Western Maryland to track her in the woods at night. She's going to have to sleep the first night in the loft of a barn and the second night in a cave. I mean, it's Oprah. Can't say no to Oprah, so we're going to throw everything at her.
Has this podcast made you more curious about American history, freedom movements, and visiting sites where history comes alive? Sign up for our Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters newsletter to receive Revolution to Rights America at 250 resources to engage, reflect, and be the first to know about in-person and virtual meetups with the Boston Sisters.
Subscribe to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters on your favorite podcast platform to be notified about the Revolution to Rights series and more podcasts spotlighting recent historical dramas.
Thank you for catching this episode of Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters. We hope you enjoyed our exploration of captivating historical films and series dramas. Find us on Instagram at Historical Drama Sisters and on Facebook at Historical Drama Boston Sisters.
We want to hear from you. What historical dramas are you watching? Share your favorites. We may feature them in a future episode. Don't forget to subscribe. Visit our website at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters and share the podcast with fellow historical drama enthusiasts.
Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters is brought to you by the Michonne Boston Group. The views and opinions expressed on Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters are those of the speakers and do not represent the positions or views of the Michonne Boston Group, its clients, or affiliates. This is Michonne Boston.
And this is Taquina Boston.
Thank you for listening.